Hi, it's Katrina. Number 9. Ancient mass slave burial. A little less than 2,000 years ago, during the Roman occupation of Britain, several dozen slaves worked at an elite village in what is now Somerset, England. When they died, they were often buried with brooches, pottery, and other grave goods. Their graves were discovered last year while a school was being built on the property. Archaeologists excavated the remains of 50 people, who they think were mostly ancient Brits who were native to the area and adopted Roman customs. Small nails found at some of the individuals' feet showed that they were laid to rest wearing their leather hobnail work boots. A few of the skeletons seem to belong to higher-ranking members of society, including one woman who was buried with her head on a pillow. They likely lived and worked at a nearby villa, even though no traces of one have been found yet. The team has identified the remains of other buildings, including a barn and an outhouse, as well as traces of Iron Age roundhouses. Evidence shows that the enslaved laborers adhere to a mix of Roman and Iron Age customs. Lead archaeologist Steve Membury described the site as the most comprehensive modern excavation of a Roman cemetery in Somerset. He credits modern technology with making the discovery possible and hopes to carry out DNA and isotope testing on the remains to learn more about who the individuals were. Number 8. A constipated death. Sometime between 1400 and 1000 years ago, a man living in what is now southwest Texas survived mostly on grasshoppers during the final months of his life. He suffered from Chagas disease, which prevented him from digesting food properly and led to malnourishment. The man also had a painful condition called megacolon, which causes a person's colon to swell up to 6 times its normal size. His remains were discovered in a rock shelter in 1937. Since then, scientists have performed numerous studies on them. Recent research found that during the final 2 to 3 months of his life, the man was likely unable to walk or eat on his own. In the words of researcher Carl Reinhard, it appears as though the ailing man's caretakers removed the legs from grasshoppers and fed him these squishable parts of the insects. Reinhard explained that the grasshoppers would have been high in moisture and protein, making it easier for him to eat when his megacolon was in its early stages. Another recent study found that his body contained the remains of food that he was unable to digest, as well as 2.6 pounds of feces, which means that he was extremely constipated for months. One thing is especially clear: the man's death was slow and excruciating. The findings also show that his culture valued taking care of their sick, even when it meant that the person couldn't do much to contribute to society. Essentially, this discovery, while kind of creepy, indicates earlier civilizations engaged in a type of hospice care, making them less primitive than we might have believed. Number 7. The blood of Saint Januarius. Saint Januarius was a bishop in Italy who died as a martyr in 305 AD. Little else is known about him. He was supposedly thrown to some wild bears who beheaded him. Some of his blood was placed into a container and brought to Naples. To this day, the blood is kept in a sealed glass vessel at the Cathedral of Naples, where he is the patron saint. The dried blood is said to liquefy on 3 separate occasions every year: September 19th, December 16th, and the Saturday before the first Sunday in May. Thousands of spectators gather for these events in hopes of witnessing the miracle firsthand. The blood sometimes fails to liquefy, which many consider to be a sign of an impending catastrophe. A famine in 1559, a cholera outbreak in 1833, the beginning of World War II, and the Nazi occupation of Italy all happened around times when the blood of Saint Januarius remained dry. This also happened in 1973. Later that year, a cholera epidemic swept through Naples. Then, in 1980, the blood's failure to liquefy was connected with the deaths of 2,900 people in an earthquake in southern Italy. It was the worst natural disaster in Italian post-war history. When the blood stayed dry in December 2016, the chapel's abbot urged people to continue praying in hopes that it would transform. But nothing happened, so the abbot urged worshippers to continue praying and to avoid thinking about tragedies. In a strange turn of events, Cardinal Crescenzio Sepe, the Archbishop of Naples, fell ill as the blood was liquefying in September 2018. Out of nowhere, he felt faint and had to sit down. On the bright side, at least the blood transformed, perhaps avoiding even bigger problems. Number 6. Nataruk Massacre. When two groups of people fight, one usually has something tangible that the other one wants, such as land or valuables. But researchers initially struggled to determine a motive for why a band of attackers brutally massacred a group of locals 10,000 years ago in what is now Kenya. Human remains that were found along what was once the southwestern edge of Lake Turkana bear signs of horrifying injuries caused by arrows and clubs. The bodies consist of 21 adults and 6 children who died violently. They were killed using weapons made from obsidian that was sourced from far away, indicating that the assailants were outsiders who were new to the area. At the time, people lived in nomadic groups of hunter-gatherers. The massacre victims left behind no signs of any nearby settlements or valuables. So if the attackers didn't like the group they crossed paths with, couldn't they have just avoided a confrontation and gone in a different direction? Experts are still learning about the dynamics between different hunter-gatherer societies, so they don't have a solid answer to that question yet. Archaeologist Marta Mirazón Lar explained that the preconditions for warfare among humans have been present since before we had civilizations, farming, material wealth, and social hierarchies. In other words, people have always been prepared to fight. She suggested that the beachside location was a desirable place to eat and hunt, and that this might have motivated the attackers to slaughter their victims. And now for number 5, but first want to give a big shout out to Melissa Watson and the Blue Moon. Thanks so much for spending time with us and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Number 5. A looted grave. Conservation officers in Harrison County, Indiana, received what was probably one of the strangest calls of their careers in 2016, when they were summoned to the site of a looted 19th century grave. Located on a remote, privately owned property, the burial belonged to someone named Nancy Brown, who died at age 47 in 1881. Her grave was located among others in a cemetery with no public access, which means that the trespassers somehow knew what they were looking for. In other words, it appeared to be a very planned and deliberate act. It was a disturbing scene, according to conservation officer Jim Schreck, who told reporters that he believed multiple people worked together to carry tools to the site. They would have had to haul the equipment on foot for at least a half mile. Archaeologists reported to the scene to assist with the investigation. Unfortunately, they couldn't tell how much time had passed between the looting and when the landowner discovered the damage. It's also unclear what the motives were or why Nancy Brown's grave was targeted. When the story hit headlines, investigators were working with genealogists to locate any of Brown's surviving relatives. They were also eager to find the grave robbers. It's unknown what, if anything, ever came of the story. What do you think was the reason behind the grave robbery? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Number 4. Unknown Man E. During the late 19th century, French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero was unwrapping mummies that were found in Egypt's Valley of the Kings when he came across the remains of a young man bearing no clues to his identity. He was wrapped in sheepskin, which the ancient Egyptians considered to be an unclean material. Even more strangely, the man's hands and feet were bound, and he appeared to be screaming. He also wasn't mummified according to traditional customs, the absence of an incision on his abdomen serving as clear evidence that his internal organs hadn't been removed. Maspero and his colleagues concluded that the man had been poisoned to death or asphyxiated or met some other type of foul play. Still unaware of his identity, they nicknamed him Unknown Man E. Scientists still don't know who he was. One theory proposes that Unknown Man E was a Hittite prince. According to the Royal Archives, the prince was murdered near the Egyptian border after being sent there to marry King Tut's widow. As a foreigner, he would not have received the typical mummification and burial that were given to members of Egyptian society. Another idea suggests that Unknown Man E was a high-ranking individual who died in an area where mummification knowledge and technology were scarce, perhaps while on a military campaign. And maybe the culture that handled his body did not view sheepskin in the same negative context that the Egyptians did, and meant no disrespect to the remains. A third theory entertains the possibility that unknown man E is Ramses III's son, Prince Pentewere, who was executed for participating in a conspiracy against his father. Unfortunately, experts are no closer now than they were a century ago to identifying the mummy. Number 3. Weeping statues. A plaster statue of the Madonna in Syracuse, Sicily, has been continuously shedding tears since 1953. It's one of dozens of Catholic statues that have allegedly been seen crying, but it's the only one recognized by the Church as a true miracle. All other reported sightings of weeping statues are either unverified or were proven to be hoaxes. The Catholic Church investigates these types of claims very thoroughly, and they are not quick to label something a miracle. Instead, officials prefer to let the phenomenon play out to see if signs of a hoax appear, or if the event is ultimately disproved by science. The statues in question are known to cry a variety of liquids, including human blood, tears, olive oil, and scented oils. Some cases, such as the crying Padre Pio statue in Sicily, are quickly debunked as the deceptive result of someone placing the tears on the statue. In this case, a woman used her own blood. Other instances of crying statues are less clear-cut. In 2018, for example, an Our Lady of Guadalupe sculpture began shedding tears of scented olive oil at a church in New Mexico. The substance, known as chrism, is considered sacred when blessed. At first, even the church's priest admittedly struggled to believe that the phenomenon was real. According to the church's business manager, however, a thorough review of their security footage proved that nobody could have done anything to make the statue cry artificially. But skepticism remains high, and even the famed Madonna of Syracuse statue has more or less been debunked by science. In 1995, a chemistry researcher at the University of Padua named Luigi Garlaschelli claimed to have figured out how a simple plaster statue could be manipulated into crying on its own. But it's very difficult to gain access to relics for experimental or investigative purposes, and the Madonna of Syracuse therefore retains its miraculous status for now. Number 2. Kudnahora Mass Grave. The 14th century cemetery church of All Saints in the Czech Republic has a long-established macabre reputation. Nicknamed the Bone Church, this UNESCO World Heritage Site is famous for housing the bones of somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 people, including 14th century plague victims and those who died in the Bohemian Wars. The bones line the walls and ceiling and are arranged decoratively throughout the church, including in the chandelier. The property's dark history deepened in 2017 when archaeologists announced the nearby discovery of the remains of more than 1,200 people. They made the grisly discovery while renovating the medieval ossuary and church, which had started leaning because the soil was unstable. The bodies were found inside 34 mass graves, which contained victims of the Black Death and a famine in the 1300s. It was not a great time to be alive, it looks like. It might be the largest burial ground ever discovered in Europe. Men outnumbered women, indicating that the deceased were a mining population. Additional research shows that the cemetery became a popular burial place because it supposedly contains a handful of soil from the hill where Jesus was crucified. Eventually, the cemetery reached its capacity, and the church's lower level became a place for storing excess bones from mass burials and old graves that had fallen into disrepair. Starting in 1870, the bones were arranged into the elaborate patterns seen at the church today. Number 1. Bizarre burials. While working at the Beshtasheni burial site in southeastern Georgia in 2016, archaeologists discovered 16 strange graves dating back to the late Bronze and early Iron Ages. Most were covered with stone slabs, or a stone or dirt mound. One of the most interesting burials belonged to a headless man and woman, who were presumably a couple. There were 2 bronze arrows lodged into the female's body, one in her leg and one in her ribs near her heart, and it's very possible that this is what caused her death. She was somewhere between 17 and 25 years old when she died. The man buried next to her was between 19 and 25. The pair were placed in fetal positions on their right sides. Their grave contained an iron dagger, a bronze strip covered in geometric designs, and a collection of ceramic vessels. Another bizarre burial contained the head of another woman who was also between 17 and 25 years old when she died. Her skull was surrounded by grave goods, including beads, small vessels, and a handful of metal objects. The largest and most remarkable grave was occupied by a man who was buried in fetal position. He was accompanied by a 1.6-foot-long dagger decorated with images of deer and horses, as well as bronze and iron arrowheads, animal bones, and a horn. The burial also contains something called a pedestal vessel. These tall, slender containers have a large upper lip and are unique to the region. Interestingly, a lot of them were found at the site. A lot of weapons were also unearthed from this cemetery, indicating that the society had a strong militaristic culture and that it buried its soldiers alongside its farmers. Thanks for watching! What was your favorite discovery? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe before you go. See you next time. Bye!